The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is our monthly episode 4, where we get to ask our speaker all the questions that we've gotten from our episodes for the month so far. And by the way, thanks for all your questions and feedback. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Wirkus. We're very fortunate this month to be talking about eating disorders, and we're thankful to Megan Jensen and Nicole Holland for coming back to answer a couple of questions. Welcome back, Megan and Nicole.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul.
Before we dive in, do you want to talk about any disclosures?
Nothing's come up since we last chatted, so.
Oh, and even less for me, so we're
Even
good to
less
go.
for you. We encourage our listeners to send in any conflicts they can think of for Megan and Nicole, or both. We think that some will come through. Let's dive in with the questions. First question, what's the best way to help a parent with an eating disorder help their child develop a healthy relationship with food?
That is a really good question, because I think a lot of parents are in that kind of situation. Not necessarily like their child has an eating disorder, but a lot of parents, and rightly so, are concerned about how do I make sure that my child's relationship with food is healthy. And I think it sometimes can require a little bit of almost like a rewiring of kind of things that we grew up with. I think of my parents growing up in the 70s, 80s, and how that was kind of like diet culture kingdom, right? Not that it's better now, but I feel like it was almost a little worse then. Really trying to be as neutral as possible is kind of the best piece of advice that I generally give parents. Let's be neutral about the food and not cut out any foods. And if you yourself as a parent have your own distorted thoughts about food, like now's the time to kind of figure that out and work on it with your child.
Yeah. I think the good old fashioned airplane analogy on this one, you have to put on your own face mask first. And I think as parents, we have to take onus for our own insecurities and our own lack of education before we're able to step in and educate our kids and be there for our kids. So kind of talking about what we talked about a lot last week, but burying our heads in the sand, pretending it's not an issue doesn't help anyone in the long run. So whether that's making an appointment to meet with a therapist or with a dietitian like Megan, making sure that we take care of ourselves first so that we can then help and support our kids, because we can't support them if we're not able to be there for ourselves. There's a parenting class I signed up for, and they go through a parenting pyramid, and it goes through the steps of correction and teaching, learning, but at the very bottom of the base of how to parent and develop that relationship is developing your own self and creating a sense of self that is something that your kids can trust, and building that relationship of trust with your child first. And then you're able to teach from that place. If you're teaching your kids about an issue that you don't have integrity with yourself, I think it's going to always fall short. So taking whatever steps you need to build that integrity within yourself, and then you can teach from that place.
One of the things that I think we struggle with as pediatricians sometimes is you show a parent a growth chart, and when we talk about percentiles, then I think people feel they're being graded sometimes. That if you're at the 25th percentile, obviously that's D- range, or is there a way to sort of tease apart? Because the point I always try to make is consistency, but look how consistent your child is. But I think there's a lot of anxiety about, right, but there are a lot of kids who weigh more, so they must be eating more. How do we help people recognize that eating more isn't necessarily the answer they're looking for?
Yeah, I think growth charts can cause unnecessary anxiety. And I think also on the flip side, unnecessary peace of mind in some ways, because when it comes to eating disorders, where I agree where it's consistency is really important. If a kiddo's always been at the 25th percentile, I am not going to expect them to be much higher versus at the same time, if a kiddo's been at the 75th percentile, I'm not going to expect much change. However, when it comes to eating disorders, sometimes we'll see a dramatic change in the percentile, whether a dramatic decrease or a dramatic increase, which could be cause for concern potentially, or at least cause us to question, okay, what's been going on? Maybe we'll dive a little bit deeper and figure out what are the things that have been happening. But additionally, there are some kiddos that are going to have eating disorders and restrictive eating disorders, and their growth chart's not going to change. But that doesn't mean that it's not an issue. And so it's good that the growth may not have been affected by the eating disorder, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a problem that needs to be addressed. And so I kind of get the feedback from parents sometimes with, well, that's not impacting their growth. I'm like, okay, yes, right now, but also there's more to nutrition than just, is my weight changing or not? And so growth charts can be a really helpful tool. I don't remember if I mentioned this in the episodes prior, but one thing I always grew up with my dad as an engineer is how many data points do you have for whatever his electrical engineer mind? How much data? What does the data say?
Yeah.
And so like growth charts are a data point in this process of trying to unpack what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. It can tell a lot depending on how the body reacted to the eating disorder, but it's not the whole story by any means.
I think, like Megan has mentioned before, as providers, we have to look at the holistic view of kids, and a growth chart is one measure, but we also have to look at their social interactions with family, how they're doing with friends and peers. There's so many different aspects that we have to look at that may be impacted. But let's talk dietitian speak. If you look at an example like a recipe, if you're only focusing on one part of that recipe, the end product isn't going to go well. So you have to look at all the different aspects of the child, their interaction with their family, their interaction with their peers. Their growth chart is one measure, but it's not every measure. And we have to make sure we're not hyperfixating or only looking at one aspect of how they're doing as a whole person.
It feels like that part of what we're saying here is that we can fixate on the calorie part of it, but that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about global nutrition, which is something you guys obviously know much more than I do. Is there a healthiest way to encourage breadth without making kids sit at the table till you eat every bite?
Ideally, this idea of a healthy relationship with food and eating a wide variety of foods and things, ideally, we're starting teaching these principles from a very young age. Kiddos from toddler age, I guess earlier as well, but they've done research on toddlers specifically, and toddlers are picking up these messages, even if we're not intending to send them. There's been research on parents who don't have good relationships with food and mothers who are breastfeeding, and how that infant is more likely to grow up with a negative relationship with food. And there's lots of other factors that are involved in that. But ideally, we're starting at conception, really, right? When it comes to developing healthy relationships with food. However, sometimes we don't recognize until the kiddos are much older that, oh, maybe that was not the healthiest model or healthiest thing that I taught. And so better late than never. And so
Right,
even
right.
if they're a little bit older, doing our best to talk about what are all of the reasons why we eat food. Calories and nutrition and vitamins and minerals are a big part. That's important. But I was talking with a patient yesterday and I said, okay, like you're going on a trip and newly diagnosed with anorexia. This is probably causing some stress. So how are we going to enjoy time with our family while we're on this trip and eat yummy food? And we talked about all the different reasons why we eat food, connection and memories, just celebrating, just because it tastes good, all these different reasons why, and can encourage variety and breadth as kiddos start to understand that it's okay if this food does not have the most vitamin and mineral content that's ever been seen ever in our food intake.
Yeah, I think previous conversations we've talked about intuitive eating. That's a principle kids are born with. When they come into the world, they have an innate sense of hunger and fullness cues, and as they grow, they develop and learn those social aspects of food and those other aspects of food. And I think as parents, providing that structure again, like providing a variety of options and then talking about food in a variety of ways, not about calories, but about, like Megan said, the social aspect, but also the celebratory aspect, the color, the aesthetics of it, the texture, the way foods taste and complement each other. I think talking about food like you would talk about any other aspect of a kid's life and not focusing just on the calorie value. So they have an idea of food not as like this negative, bad thing, but as this aspect of life that has a lot of different dimensions. And how can we incorporate that in our lives in a way that allows us to move and play and be healthy, but also discussing it in a structured way where they're allowed to have different options and make those decisions for themselves so that we're not controlling them as parents, because that doesn't end up boding well either if we're controlling and not allowing them to make decisions for themselves, but allowing them to explore those options for themselves as well within the structure of, hey, here's a complete table full of different foods. And some are going to be vegetables and some are going to be fruit. And then there's going to be some grains and some desserts, and allowing them within a structured meal to choose themselves what they'll have.
Last question, I think, is sort of an extension of this, as well as partly a reiteration of things we've talked about this month, but again, I think fits in with something that we deal with all the time. And that's over the past 20 years or so. One of the great challenges has been increasing obesity in children. How do we approach that issue in a way that's uplifting and that isn't likely to demonize a child's relationship with food?
That is a heady question. I'm going to try to not dive too deep because I feel like that's a series of books right
Right,
on that
right. Yeah,
topic.
yeah, yeah.
A couple main points come to mind. One is there are so many factors that impact. They talk about the kind of the phrase like calories in, calories out, which in of itself, it's a very simple phrase to talk about a very complex metabolism and the different things that impact someone's metabolism, such as it could be as simple as genetics. It could be someone may not feel safe exercising and moving in the area that they live in. It could be different advertisements of food that are directed towards children. There's a graphic that the United Kingdom came out with. This was like 2021, I believe, and somewhere around there, give or take a year or so. And it's a graphic depicting all of, well, it's supposed to be a simplified version of everything that impacts someone's metabolism. And it's a very complex picture. And I'm happy to send that to you guys. I don't know if there's
That'd
a
be
way
great.
for people to see it, but this is probably one of the most complex webs graphics I've ever seen in my entire life. There are so many things that impact someone's weight. And so when we talk about this increase in childhood obesity, I think it's also important to think about, are there factors that are impacting this outside of the child's nutrition? And the answer is absolutely yes. There are so many things that impact it. And so we definitely want to come from the perspective of, let's talk about healthy, nutritious habits, even those that are outside of just food choices and eating. Let's just develop a healthy relationship with life and body. And the weight's going to do what it's going to do. Research shows time and time again that the body's resistant in a lot of ways to change, and that includes weight loss. And so any chronic dieter can tell you that there's generally weight cycling that happens, and the diet industry makes money on telling you that it's your fault that you gain the weight back, when really it's just your body being like, oh, that wasn't great. Not a fan. I don't feel very safe or protected, so I'm going to make some changes. That's just another thing that impacts the metabolism. And so it's the healthy outlook and healthy relationship with nutrition and body in life that is more indicative of a healthy long life than let's address weight right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think part of the impetus for this question is that providers are often graded by health plans by whether they have noted the body mass index. And I think we all recognize the body mass index is an imperfect measure at best. But as a provider, I'm not always sure what to do with that information, whether I have helped anyone's life at all by pointing out their body. Sometimes, definitely, yes. But sometimes I think that by dwelling on that, we shift the focus, what you're describing as sort of a holistic process, to a what's wrong with you? Why are you gaining weight?
I agree. Jumping off of what Megan said, I think we need to make sure, again, we're taking a holistic view of the person. We know scientifically there are health outcomes associated with lifestyle habits that can be impacted. But we also know that there are so many aspects of a person's well being, like Megan said, when we hyperfixate on weight. If a child develops an eating disorder, how is that going to impact their mental health and their physical well being? Because that's not going to have any better health outcomes than the other side of it. So often, if we focus on that measure as the one measure, we are then losing sight of all the other health impacts that we're creating or causing because of the one thing that we thought we needed to fix. We then catalyze all these other domino effects of other health outcomes that are negatively impacted, whether that's a social isolation because they feel shamed, or
Yeah.
mental health because they don't feel like their value is enough. But because we're focused on A, we don't see B, C, D, E that then are caused because of A.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
hope we can just see it all, like you've both said, in a holistic way, that we're just trying to help people have healthy relationships with food, have healthy relationships with exercise, have healthy relationships with the way they see themselves.
One thing that came to mind as Nicole was chatting was those who are in larger bodies and have obesity, they are about 2.5 times more likely to have an eating disorder. And the flip side of that is they're diagnosed about half the rate that those that are thinner are. There's definitely a lot of shame, right? There's a lot of people that are in larger bodies and overweight or obese bodies are restricting their eating patterns because they feel that guilt and that shame. And sometimes that turns into a restrict binge pattern. Sometimes it's just a restrict pattern. Sometimes there's purging involved, whatever the behavior is. But they are 2.5 times more likely to have eating disorders than those that are in smaller bodies. In that regard, the data speaks for itself. With this effort of trying to reduce obesity rates, are we in fact creating more problems? That is a whole ethical, moral thing
Yeah,
that
but
we can unpack.
doesn't it seem, though, that several of those unhealthy tendencies are applauded in some ways by our perfectionist dieting culture?
I actually saw a patient this morning. She's elderly. I know this is a pediatric podcast, but at age 10 or 11, she was put into a dieting group. And if she didn't lose weight in between like groups, like she had to wear a pig nose on her face to show that she did not lose weight. That was the 60s or 70s. So that was a while ago, and I understand that. But that is kind of how people in larger bodies are viewed in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
because the comment section on social media is nothing like that.
Yeah. Megan, I do see, obviously not that extreme, but I've mentioned I have kiddos in elementary school. And I know as young as like 6th grade, the elementary schools are sending emails out and just letting parents know 6th grade, and it goes both genders, but 6th grade girls in particular, they won't eat lunch because they don't like eating lunch in front of their peers because they feel judged. So it is still a very socially prominent issue of feeling shame about how or what we're eating or how we're feeling. And so I do think it's still an issue. It's not as dramatic as that, but it's still a social battle.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you so much for your time. The hopeful note that I think I'm taking from all this is the point that you've repeated time and again, both in the past 3 weeks as well as today. And that's that it's important that we recognize the many joyful parts of food and of the social importance that it has. And it's just important for us to help everyone find the joy in who they are and in this stuff we do.
One of the things I always tell my patients, which is maybe my parting thought here, is when I think about my favorite meal, my favorite dishes, things that remind me of my childhood, it's never the salad. It's never, that's not what I think of. And that's never what comes to mind. Let's remember to focus on these other aspects of it because they're important.
And I'll just add really quick, working with Megan, one of the things I found most rewarding, it's not about the client eating cookies again or whatever. That's not the reward that comes from working with them. It's from seeing them get their lives back, from seeing them get their family back and their hobbies and their personality back, and seeing those other areas of their lives come back into line. That's the bright side, I guess, of getting the hope on the other side.
Yeah, it's another one of life's great joy vampires, isn't it? But before we're all done, you want to throw in a plug for Boulder Way Forward?
Yeah, absolutely. As we mentioned in the other episodes, Nicole and I are working with a program out of Utah State University, and I'm an Aggie. I'm going to say it again because I love being an Aggie. So we love Utah State, but this Boulder Way Forward program, the goals of this program are to decrease discrepancies between men and women in the state of Utah. We are representing the spoke of this program that encompasses lifelong health, especially eating disorders. That's kind of what brings us to chat on the podcast. And we're just a very great program. If anyone is interested, that's a Googleable thing that will bring you right to the website. Then you can become involved if you want to.
So Google Boulder Way Forward.
Yes.
Okay. Nicole, Megan, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for all you do. And I wish we could chat all the time because I always have so many questions. Thanks for all you do to help kids.
Yep.
To our listeners, thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with more content. Thanks for your support. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design, thanks to Phil Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.